The galaxy had always viewed Earth as an afterthought, a minor world tucked into a quiet spiral arm, too far from major trade routes and too primitive to be relevant. For centuries, humanity had been excluded from the councils of power, watched with suspicion but never taken seriously. That dismissal ended the day the Galactic Council gathered to address what they called the human problem. They spoke with the practiced arrogance of civilizations that had spanned millennia. The rhetoric was familiar: humans were reckless, violent, unrestrained, too dangerous to allow into the wider order. But beneath the grand speeches was something else, something they never admitted aloud: fear. They had seen fragments of human history, whispers of wars fought to exhaustion, battles that ground empires into dust, a record of survival that read more like myth than chronology. And so, in their chamber of gleaming metals and endless banners, they declared war. The decision rippled across 1,000 worlds. To the great empires, it was a celebration. Soldiers raised glasses, politicians promised quick victory, and strategists spoke of Earth's imminent collapse. Commentators on alien networks laughed at the thought of a young species holding out for more than weeks. Analysts described humans as little more than clever savages whose technology, though surprising, could not match the industrial might of the Council. To the average galactic citizen, the war was not only just but overdue, a necessary pruning of a threat before it grew into a poison vine. If there was unease, it was buried beneath confidence and a belief in inevitability. After all, who had ever stood against the Council and lived? Earth received the declaration in silence. There were no frantic broadcasts, no public breakdowns, no appeals for mercy. Instead, there was a quiet pause, like the deep inhale before a storm. Intelligence agents hidden on Earth reported something they did not expect. There was no panic in the streets. The markets did not collapse. People spoke of the declaration not with despair, but with a strange undercurrent of resolve. Some even smiled. It unsettled the spies, because this was not the face of a species bracing for annihilation. It was the look of someone who had been waiting. Human leaders met behind closed doors, but their statements carried an edge that the Council misread as bravado. They promised defense, but the cadence of their voices carried an unshaken certainty. Those who understood Earth's history knew why. Humanity had lived with war not as an anomaly but as a companion. The species had risen out of survival contests on planes where every day was a test of endurance. Kingdoms, empires, nations had forged themselves in the crucible of violence, and in that relentless furnace, humanity had learned to endure. The Council thought they were declaring war on an immature civilization. In truth, they were giving a species forged by war exactly what it had been preparing for since its first step into firelight. As alien media played triumphant anthems, Earth's response spread in whispers. "We will not bow. We will not vanish. If you want war, we will show you what war means." The tone was not desperate. It was not defiant for its own sake. It was colder, sharper, as if humanity were welcoming a challenge finally worthy of its teeth. The Council, arrogant in its certainty, did not hear the weight beneath those words. They did not understand that Earth's silence was not hesitation. It was calculation. It was the quiet joy of a predator finally unleashed after being leashed too long. The war declaration ended with cheers in alien capitals. Fleets mobilized, banners waved, and military academies spoke of glory soon to be won. Yet on Earth, the reaction was altogether different. There was no parade, no frenzy. Only a grin that passed quietly from person to person, nation to nation, soldier to worker. It was a grin that said the galaxy had made a mistake. For humanity, this was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. The declaration had been made, and where other species would have fractured, humanity began to move with unnerving cohesion. Old rivalries that had simmered for centuries seemed to vanish overnight. Nations that once debated endlessly now spoke with one voice. Borders that had been jealously guarded became irrelevant, as militaries pooled resources and governments shared intelligence. The Council had expected bickering, but what they saw instead was a sudden unity born from the recognition of a threat too vast for division. Humanity's survival instinct, buried but never forgotten, had reawakened. Factories shifted production within days. Civilian industries converted to military output, with corporations volunteering rather than resisting. Shipyards that once built freighters now produced armored hulls. Aerospace engineers, coders, and machinists worked side by side with soldiers, creating a fusion of technical ingenuity and martial focus. What surprised the galaxy most was not just the scale of mobilization, but the speed. Where other civilizations took decades to ramp their war machines, Earth managed it in months, powered by sheer determination and an unwillingness to be passive prey. On the ground, the reaction was not despair but preparation. Citizens stockpiled supplies without panic, communities organized shelters and defense networks, and the collective mindset hardened. Humanity did not simply trust their governments to fight the war for them, they took ownership of the struggle themselves. Every individual carried the sense that survival was personal, and in that atmosphere, even the smallest efforts became contributions to a greater cause. Children painted messages of defiance on supply crates, and technicians engraved jokes onto the steel plating of warships. What unsettled alien observers most was the casual humor threaded through the preparations. The humans laughed at the challenge, finding a grim joy in their defiance. It was not the laugh of denial. It was the laugh of a species that had stared death in the face countless times and learned to smile back. Strategists from the Council could not understand the psychology. They measured morale through compliance, through solemn pledges and silent duty. What they saw in humanity was something alien to them, a deep reservoir of resilience born not from discipline alone but from stubborn optimism. Where most species relied on rigid structures to hold them together, humans drew strength from chaos itself. They thrived on uncertainty. Their soldiers trained with borrowed equipment, built improvised weapons, and still treated it as sport. Their engineers designed experimental technologies with timelines so compressed they seemed impossible, yet progress poured from labs and workshops at breakneck pace. The Council's agents whispered back reports of technology that should not have been within humanity's reach. Materials researched decades ahead of projections, artificial intelligence adapted for strategy simulations, propulsion systems modified from civilian designs into war-ready engines. It was not that humanity possessed a single overwhelming weapon, it was that they produced an endless stream of unexpected solutions, none of them conventional, all of them effective. To fight humans meant adapting not to one strategy but to dozens, layered unpredictably. Most alarming of all was the psychological shift that spread across Earth. The declaration of war had not weakened humanity's will, it had clarified it. Every historical scar became a lesson now applied. The memory of sieges, genocides, revolutions, and occupations became fuel. The darkest chapters of Earth's past, long condemned, now became grim instruction manuals on survival. Humanity did not hide from its history, it used it. The Council had assumed the weight of that history would break Earth. Instead, it bound Earth together in iron purpose. The silence after the declaration had never been fear. It had been anticipation. Humanity had heard the challenge and accepted without hesitation. What the galaxy mistook for weakness was the gathering of a storm. And as that storm grew, there was no mistaking the truth anymore. Humanity was not bracing for destruction. It was preparing for the fight it had always known was inevitable, and it was preparing with a grin. The fleets of the Council arrived with banners of inevitability. Their armadas stretched across the void like walls of steel, confident in their superiority. To them, it was not a war but an extermination campaign, a show of force meant to break resistance before it began. Yet the first clashes unraveled that certainty. Humanity did not fight in the manner the Council had prepared for. They did not meet the fleets with rigid formations or predictable maneuvers. They fought with a mixture of tradition and improvisation that defied calculation. Where the Council advanced with overwhelming firepower, humans struck from unexpected angles. Small strike groups harassed supply convoys, satellites crippled communication relays, and cyber intrusions cascaded through enemy systems like invisible storms. The shock came not from the scale of Earth's weapons but from the creativity behind them. Missiles guided through corridors of debris, railgun slugs launched from orbital stations disguised as civilian infrastructure, drones swarming with a coordination that alien tacticians found incomprehensible. Human commanders adapted mid-battle, rewriting tactics as though the battlefield were clay in their hands. No simulation the Council had run had accounted for such fluidity. The enemy expected obedience to doctrine. What they found was adaptability that looked like chaos but concealed ruthless intent. The first major engagement became a lesson the galaxy would never forget. The Council deployed a dreadnought, a vessel considered invincible, bristling with weaponry that had subdued rebellions across half a dozen sectors. It advanced with the arrogance of inevitability, only to meet a human fleet that refused to scatter. Rather than retreat, humanity drew it into a field of mines hidden within the orbit of shattered asteroids. The dreadnought survived the ambush but was crippled, its engines gutted and its shields burned out by relentless waves of improvised attacks. Images of the mighty vessel drifting helplessly spread faster than official broadcasts could suppress. For the first time, the galaxy saw that the war would not be simple. What unsettled the Council most was not just the damage inflicted, but the demeanor of their enemy. Human pilots transmitted messages laced with humor, soldiers painted grins on their armor, and commanders sent final communications to the dreadnought crew that were not threats but promises. The war had only begun. This behavior seemed irrational to alien observers. To humans, it was natural. They had always laughed at the abyss, mocked their own mortality, and turned defiance into fuel. That grin, carried across signals and intercepted transmissions, struck harder than any missile. It revealed a mindset alien civilizations could not comprehend. Humanity enjoyed the challenge. The Council attempted to crush morale with sheer numbers. They sent wave after wave, confident attrition would break the defenders. Instead, humanity absorbed the blows and answered with ingenuity. Damaged ships were repaired with astonishing speed, often patched together with parts scavenged from destroyed enemy vessels. Entire fleets returned to battle days after being written off as losses. The Council measured wars in decades, accustomed to long, grinding campaigns. Humanity waged theirs in days and weeks, compressing the tempo until alien commanders found themselves overwhelmed by a pace they could not match. Broadcasts across neutral worlds began to shift tone. At first, they spoke of human desperation. Soon, they spoke of human defiance. And then, whispers of admiration spread, even among species bound by treaty to the Council. The image of a young race standing against an empire of ages with fire in its eyes and laughter in its voice could not be contained. Each skirmish, each strike, carried not just tactical value but symbolic weight. The story of the crippled dreadnought echoed through the stars like a warning bell. The first clashes had been meant to showcase the futility of resistance. Instead, they revealed the futility of underestimating Earth. Humanity had not crumbled. It had not begged. It had grinned, bared its teeth, and drawn blood. And now the galaxy began to understand what the Council had unleashed. The war they thought would end swiftly had become something else entirely, a struggle against the species that refused to bow, a struggle against a will that turned every defeat into a new tactic, every loss into a sharpened blade. The war expanded beyond Earth's orbit and into the heart of contested space. What began as isolated engagements became a storm stretching across asteroid belts, moons, and far-flung colonies. The Council expected their sheer numbers to overwhelm, but humanity fought as though scale itself were meaningless. They struck not only at fleets but at the fragile systems empires depended on. Merchant convoys vanished, supply depots erupted in fire, and communications networks faltered under relentless electronic assault. Humanity understood that wars were not only about battles won but about lifelines severed, and they severed them with precision. Where other species relied on calculated, formal campaigns, humans embraced unpredictability as their doctrine. They weaponized terrain the Council thought irrelevant. Asteroids were nudged from their orbits, converted into kinetic hammers that bypassed shields. Mining colonies became ambush points bristling with hidden weaponry. Cargo containers carried viruses that spread not biologically but digitally, rewriting enemy logistics and causing fleets to arrive at empty coordinates. Humanity fought with an imagination that turned every corner of space into a battlefield. Alien commanders found themselves paralyzed by the unfamiliar tempo. Their strategies had been designed for enemies who obeyed rules of engagement, who fought in patterns that could be catalogued. Humanity obeyed no such boundaries. One day, fleets would charge headlong into impossible odds. The next, they would disappear into silence, re-emerging light years away to strike undefended assets. No algorithm could predict them. No tradition could contain them. Every attempt to adapt was already outdated by the time it was deployed. Casualties rose on both sides, but the spirit of Earth refused to fracture. Songs of resistance spread across communication bands, humor circulated even in the darkest hours, and soldiers carried forward with the strange lightness that came from knowing they had nothing left to lose but everything to prove. Entire cultures found strength in sharing defiance, their art, their music, their stories becoming weapons as potent as missiles. To the galaxy, it seemed incomprehensible that a species facing annihilation would still joke, still sing, still smile. Yet it was that very refusal to yield to despair that made humanity dangerous. They fought not only with weapons but with will, and that will grew sharper with every attempt to crush it. The Council itself began to show cracks. Allies who had once demanded war started to question its worth. The price in resources, the toll on morale, the humiliation of repeated setbacks, all gnawed at the unity that had seemed absolute. Some argued for escalation to annihilation, others whispered of withdrawal. The one truth none dared say aloud was that humanity had already achieved the unthinkable. They had forced the greatest coalition in history to hesitate. Humanity pressed harder, not through sheer force but through relentless creativity. A fleet appeared where no fleet should have been, sustained by fuel captured from enemy stores. Entire squadrons cloaked themselves in debris fields, emerging like ghosts to strike and vanish. Computer viruses turned command ships into liabilities, forcing admirals to issue orders by courier vessels as if they had regressed centuries. Every new trick further eroded the aura of inevitability the Council had built over millennia. The deeper truth began to reveal itself. Humanity was not merely fighting to survive. They were fighting to prove something, to themselves and to the galaxy. They sought no empire, no dominion, no tribute. They fought because someone had dared to threaten their existence, and for humanity, that was the one act that guaranteed a response without limit. They did not crave war, but once forced into it, they embraced it with an intensity that unsettled civilizations and used to absolute resistance. As fleets clashed across the stars, one message began to crystallize. Humanity had not been broken by the declaration. It had been awakened. The grin first seen in silence had now become a roar carried through battles and victories, defeats and recoveries alike. The galaxy no longer saw Earth as a backwater world. They saw it as a storm tearing through certainty, reshaping the balance of power with every strike. The war was no longer a campaign of extermination. It had become a contest of endurance, and in that contest, humanity had no equal. The war reached its breaking point not through a single decisive strike but through the relentless weight of accumulated defiance. The Council had unleashed armadas thought inexhaustible, yet humanity absorbed the blows and continued to push forward. Each battle left scars, but each scar hardened resolve. What the galaxy could not understand was that humanity's strength was not measured in fleets or weapons but in its refusal to surrender, a will that grew more dangerous the longer the war dragged on. Where other civilizations sought to preserve themselves by compromise, humans sharpened themselves through struggle. Every loss was fuel, every setback a lesson, every wound a reason to strike harder. The Council expected humanity to break beneath exhaustion, yet the opposite happened. The longer the war stretched, the more dangerous Earth became. Soldiers rotated from one front to another with minimal rest, engineers dismantled wreckage for salvage before the fires cooled, and scientists transformed desperation into invention. Humanity's endurance unnerved the galaxy. Entire sectors that should have fallen remained contested, and worlds marked for conquest became graveyards for alien fleets. What was meant to be swift eradication had transformed into stalemate, and stalemate against a young species was humiliation the Council had never imagined. The turning point came when humanity shifted from defense to unrelenting offense. No longer content with protecting its homeworld, Earth struck deep into enemy space. Fleets appeared in sectors once thought untouchable, carving through supply lines and dismantling infrastructure vital to the Council's cohesion. Worlds far from the front lines began to feel the sting of human raids. Entire systems that had believed themselves immune to consequence now faced the unsettling truth that humanity's reach was growing with every passing day. The Council, for all its centuries of dominance, realized it was fighting not a nuisance but a predator. Fear spread among populations that had once cheered the Declaration. Whispers circulated that humanity was not simply defending but preparing to exact a toll no empire could endure. Some alien leaders began to question if total annihilation was even possible. The resources expended were staggering, the casualties unsustainable, and the propaganda of inevitable victory collapsed under the weight of reality. Unity splintered, and voices rose within the council chambers demanding negotiations. Yet even as factions bickered, humanity advanced with a cold focus that ignored the politics of its enemies. What distinguished Earth from its adversaries was not merely its technology or tactics but its philosophy. Where the Council saw war as a means of control, humanity saw it as survival. There was no surrender, no acceptable defeat, only endurance until the enemy broke. That mindset turned every human into a weapon, every effort into a contribution. It was not the brilliance of a single leader or the strength of a single fleet that drove the war. It was the collective will of an entire species unwilling to vanish. The Council had unleashed a war against a race that had already mastered the art of surviving against worse odds than the stars could imagine. In the final months, Council broadcasts no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of containment, of truce, of the need to end a conflict that had bled them white. Humanity, for its part, did not demand conquest or tribute. It demanded acknowledgement that Earth was no longer a backwater world to be dismissed. The galaxy learned the truth in the most brutal way possible. Declaring war on humans did not erase them, it made them inevitable. When the terms were finally spoken, the Council did not grin. Humanity did. That expression, the one they had worn from the moment war was declared, carried through to the end. It was not triumph in the traditional sense, but something sharper, something older. It was the expression of a species forged in fire, one that had been underestimated until the galaxy learned the cost of its mistake. The war did not make humans dangerous. It revealed that they always had been. And now the stars would never forget it.